Welcome to the 5th episode of Speaking of Poetry. I'm Rennie McQuilkin, and I am delighted to be joined by the poet Joan Kantor. Joan was born and raised in New York City, whose cultural riches have been a great source of inspiration. After graduating from Queen's College, she lived and taught in Europe for 7 years. She went on to earn a master's degree from Antioch University, since which time she has been a learning disability specialist at Manchester Community College. Married to her high school sweetheart, she is the mother of 3 children and recently became a grandmother, although you wouldn't believe it. Joan lives on the Farmington River in Collinsville. The joy she takes in friendship, nature, traveling, and the arts is richly reflected in the poetry you are about to hear. Joan Kantor.
Thanks so much, Rennie. I suspect that for many of you, the experience of poetry came probably in high school, and it was very dense, very heavy, very dry. And I didn't enjoy it very much. And it was mostly because I didn't understand a lot of it. And as I got older and I read more contemporary poetry, I realized that poetry could be accessible and it could be something that we can all understand. And I've decided that it should be. And the power for poetry, is that it has the ability to distill experience and beauty, ugliness, down to its purest form. And I strive to write that way, and that's the poetry that I enjoy the most. And I'm going to do something today that's different than I've ever done before. I'm going to read a poem that I've never read before. And it's actually a poem about having been to a reading. And it's really a compilation of a lot of readings that I've been to when I was younger and also recently that just didn't work for me. And then I'll explain a little further. But one thing that I do want to mention is that right now I'm reading the biography of Steve Jobs. And though I certainly don't feel that I can connect with his personality, it's interesting to me that his aesthetic sense is one that I can very much connect to. His concept of accessibility and beauty coming from simplicity and attention to detail is very, very important to me. But anyway, let me read you this poem, which will give you a sense of what I'm trying not to do here, and I hope that my reading will be a flip side of this. It's called A Sense of Audience. Round and round with stories he goes. Why bother to read the poems? The next poet drones from a sci-fi world that only he knows. The third is so private, elusive. Sadly, the audience is falling asleep, and I leave before I leave, since it's all about them and not me. And I really feel that it should be about you. So come along with me, and I will share what you will hopefully be able to connect with. There will be some things that you'll be able to connect with more than others. The first poem that I'm going to read is called Broken Blossoms. And I am not trying to put down teachers in reading this poem. It's more to present the concept of adult power in children's lives. Broken Blossoms. The slightest sound of school bells pulls me from shelter of time back to her classroom of terror, where tiny psyches were meeting the end of what should have been the beginning, afraid to open their minds. Only those on sturdy stems will survive. And that's about a first grade experience that I had. And thankfully, I am a survivor. And I'm going to read another poem about teachers. And we sometimes forget that teachers have a life other than educating our children. The poem is called Friday After School. She turns the key, pressing her exhaustion against the opening door. Emptiness sucks her in. She hears the echo of her heel and toe tapping on tile. Gravity pulls her into a chair. A newspaper finds her fingers, but the words are lost. Others' needful children become a background hum, the rhythm of her own life, staccato, like the pummeled, tightly stretched skin of a drum. Her center is worn thin. I'm going to be a little more playful with this one. I tend to be a person of minor obsessions, and when I like something, I really like it. This poem is called Seaweed Sounds. This is based on a trip that my husband and I recently took to the coast of Maine. Seaweed Sounds. Walking the breakwater, I notice it peeking out from between the rocks and bend down to pick it up. This straggly bunch of slippery, dripping black and gold ribbon strands. Their surfaces dotted with small, oval, swollen pockets. I hold a piece of childhood in my hands. Memories of strolling the beach with Daddy, my sister, and Popo. Skimming stones and shells. My toes dancing at the water's edge, digging and wriggling into the hard, soft sand. The laughter of unabashed joy. And I press my fingers hard against the seaweed's fluid-filled bumps. But they're too wet, not ready yet. I remember pressing those tiny pouches just to hear them snap. And suddenly, I know why I love the touch and popping sounds of bubble wrap. My husband and I lived in Europe for about 7 years when we were really young. And this poem is about an experience that we had where we were a little tipsy and we were sharing one bike. It's called The Circle. Filled with overflow of life, our bicycle thickly spills to the ground. Clumsy, loving laughter, tipsy and twisted within the spokes. In the fog of foreign night, along the walled-in, cobbled way, an old man appears, wistfully smiling, watching us. He whispers, "J'étais jeune aussi." I too was once young. Okay. The next poem I'm going to read, my husband gave me permission to read. So it's called The Affair. And we just celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary, so. The Affair. In every other way, though it's cliche, he is the perfect husband. I really shouldn't complain, especially since I'm so high maintenance. He deserves a reprieve. It began 7 years ago. Innocently, I knew all about it. I forgave. I decided open marriage has its place. But it's getting old. I'm envious of the time they spend together. He's only mine during bad weather. I get tossed the scraps of time. All balance is off. Hoping to maintain the status quo, he refuses to see. He's chosen the golf course over me. This next poem is actually based on a story that my mother told me, and told me many times when I was a child. She and my father were living in Mississippi during World War II. And this poem is called Worlds Removed, for my mother. Far from her familiar world, my mother sat on the Mississippi train, watching a young woman board, a tiny sack of skin and bones hanging limply from her arms, whimpering. As in reflex, she swayed to the beat. Her thin, worn, empty, pale-faced, lost between drooping straw hat and shapeless red hillbilly dress, had withdrawn from a world whose cries she could no longer hear. The next poem is a very different story. My daughter recently got married to a wonderful young man who grew up in Oaxaca, Mexico, and his family invited us down to visit. And there's one word in here that I just want to mention. It's mercado. And mercado means market in Spanish. The lesson: Oaxaca State, Mexico. At the mercado, in this dusty, decrepit town, under brightly colored awnings, people sell socks and belts as flies sit on slabs of meat and stick to sweet cookies and cakes. barely 4 feet tall, burnished brown, leather-faced women in embroidered skirts and shawls balance heavy baskets and pots on their heads as young women slap and toss tortillas from hand to hand, while their children run unattended through the crowds. We sit on a bench and watch, a scruffy little boy of 3 leaning back with tummy exposed, pull out his tiny penis as an arc of liquid spurts. After carefully taking this in, his baby sister pulls down her pants and pees all over her clothes, then proudly pulls them up again and jauntily tags along. Next 2 poems that I'm going to read are, one of them was one of my older poems, and the second one is one of my newer poems, and there's a strange kind of a connection to the 2 poems, other than in the title. And the first poem is called Discovery's Child, and I wrote that when I was dealing with a 1.5-year-old, very curious child, and I was struggling with how does one discipline a child without squelching their curiosity. Discovery's Child. His eyes only reach the beginnings of things. His fingers accomplish the rest. Don't touch, he must, or images taunt. Sparkling tangibly, temptingly smooth. Is it empty or full? He'll climb to find out. Shards clatter round, seems a small price to pay. Yet someday, while he's gazing at sculpture, and the keen sense of touch comes alive, he'll hold back, never remembering. He harbors Discovery's Child. The next poem is called Rediscovery, and how it came about is from the other end of the spectrum. My mother is in the early stages of dementia, and I took her to the New Britain Museum of Art, and she loves museums, loves art, and she shocked me by walking over to a painting and running her hand across the surface and looked at me bewildered when I questioned her. And so this poem came out of that, and it's called Rediscovery. He stares at the painting, his eyes and mind dimmed with age. He's moved way past the forbidden, and as shiny, thick swirls of deep blue-green brushstrokes call him to touch, he feels the texture with the tips of his fingers, and finally sees. His senses flare with a primitive thrill of sloshing sounds in the dark as he sinks into the surface and sways in the reminiscence of gentle waves, rocking and riding these softest of swells to the undercurrent's distant, steady pulse. There's no point in telling him not to touch. He's compelled, rediscovering the beginning at the end. I want to read 2 poems about my mother. One I wrote a few years ago and is actually in the book, and it's called She Was. Will I remember just the forgetting, not the fierceness of hands on hips, her meekness morphed into mother bear, not the gentle control of family turmoil with a look, not the shopping trips filled with confidences, or the sweet soprano of kitchen sink songs, but the scratchy, record-skipped stories instead, my mind glazing over with effort to listen to what makes me cringe, recipes gone, foods prepared 1,000 times but never made before. This one-time giver of sukkar is shuffling, dwindling, shriveling into a dot, as small as the details of daily life. She suffocates us while surrounding herself with the safety of sameness. She's gone. The next poem is about my mother, me and my mother, and it's called Lost Between the Lines. Where did the edges of my memories end and hers begin? Only hazy bits and pieces were mine. The bars of my crib, the pink and gray flowered curtains, the couch cushions turned into forts. She filled in between the lines. but now my mother's fading fast. We stare across an empty space, trying to find the words to my past. Well, we seem to be into family right now. I didn't mean to put this poem here, but I think it's actually appropriate. The next poem is called For Safety's Sake. And I'm sure that most of you have had the experience of difficult relationships with family members. And not like a spouse where you can have a divorce, but a relative. Could be a mother, a brother, a child, what have you. But somebody that you want to keep in your life very much, somebody you love very much, but just don't know how to get along with. And you want to make it work. And this poem is about that experience. For safety's sake. Blood is thicker than water. Perhaps that's why we're stuck. She believes we're close. But I know she floats in the shallows, only diving deep to blame, refusing to explore the murky past that to her is crystal clear. We violently clash, till swiftly she rises to the surface. And though I hope for more, I may just have to avoid the shoals and safely swim beside her. Switching tracks here. I write a lot of poetry about nature, and I have a particular love of anything to do with the water, and a very special fondness for Cape Cod, and especially Wellfleet. And this poem takes place in Wellfleet at the marsh. It's called Unaware. I walk through the salt marsh, surrounded by the fiddler's soothing hum. What seem to be tranquil flats, up close, are scrambling with thousands of lopsided crabs digging tunnels in a tuneful race against tides. But I'm in no hurry on my path of firm, wet sand as I slowly pass through a palette of greens, in flattened swirls of salt hay, clumps of sea pickles, and tall, sturdy grasses with upright, off-white tassels. Telltale signs are everywhere, in straw-like, wave-shaped detritus at the base of dunes, and rivulets of fast-moving water. But like tiny fish and sea creatures in microcosmic pools, unaware of being left behind. I'm alive in this changing world of plants, sea, and sand, with no sense of time or tides. Well, it looks like I'm back to family again. This poem and the poem that follows it are about my youngest son, Daniel. And when I wrote the first poem, I go back and I read it now and I think I must have been prescient. I must have sensed something. And he's much younger than the other children, and we tended to push him to do certain things to keep up with everybody. So this poem is called Selective Memories. My most fragile baby bird, so novelty-legged, is chirping and cheeping fear and delight. Wildly he pumps and overtakes the flock. Cocky, standing up, pushing on the pedals, rattling chains, he whirs up down hills. Till forgetting his newness of skill, I steer him astray, suggesting he look at the view. Turning his head and his handlebars, he veers wildly off the path, bumping downhill towards a tree. After the crash, there is silence. While waiting long seconds for breath to return, he pushes my comforts away. Will his memories be of flight or of falling? Mine are of his trembling sparrow bones. Now, the next poem, it's called Incurable, and it's also about Daniel, but about 10 years later. And there's a word in here that somebody told me they didn't know the meaning of, so I'll just mention it. It's bromide, and it's just basically reassuring comments that people might make, like, oh, everything's going to be okay. And it's in this poem. Incurable. I hopelessly try to calm myself with bromides, while deep inside him, Cells are growing wildly out of control, stealing his life. I'm trying to fill that chasm, despair, with the hope that comes with uncertainty. Fear lurks, possibility wanes. In vulnerable youth, he's living his life, while I mourn for the future that's missing. And the good news about that is that it was a misdiagnosis, and he's actually fine now. It's another poem about my husband. It's called Beautiful Man. For years, his head was covered in thick brown waves. Now he's gone bald in a beautiful way, from brown to gray to white, strands drawn straight back over his pate. What's left is lush, collar curling, with tufts around his ears. I love it when it gets this way. He says it's gotten too long, lacking vanity he doesn't see. Lets the barber remove the frame from his face. I suggest a change. With scissors and trimmer in hand, I lovingly clip and preen, breathing in the scent of his scalp, patting and pushing his head into place. I snip and sculpt, each lump and bump under my tools, part of a life well lived. This is another family poem. It's called As It Must Be. I want to give the empty nest cliche a rest. What's next? Remember the book I read to you over and over again? Where is my mother? The little chick cried. Where is she now? Where will she be? Rolls are unraveling. Weathered twigs fall to the ground. As I mother, my little chick no longer cries for me. When We Communed is about my relationship with my father, which was very tumultuous, except when it wasn't. When we communed, my father talked incessantly and wore Hawaiian shirts. He engulfed and embarrassed us all, except when we went fishing. The rocking motions of the boat and the soil scent of baited hooks transformed him. Sunshine and salt air were enough. We sat in perfect silence, dropping our lines, waiting for our poles to bend. The next poem is about my granddaughter, and when I wrote this poem, she was about 2 years old. For Isabella. She loves the tickles, begs for more. I adore the husky chortle reverberating from her tiny being, and those pouty lips spouting perfect imperfections. Blonde hair, big blue eyes, and a cherub's face, so out of place with my roots. But I feel my blood pulsing through her. She's the precious part of what her parents once had. Her foundation's been shattered. We fill the cracks with love. I wrote this poem last year about this time of year when the weather was quite different. It's called A New View. Listening for the slight sounds of snow, bereft of warmth, I breathe in cold, release it into swirls, push off with my poles, heading towards lake and sky, then stop to skid stones over ice. Looking beyond the bare branches, I see Florida's not the change I need. This next poem is dedicated to all people, but especially children, who are different. It's called In Need of a Weed. Disheveled, with roots stuck firmly in dirt, your free-spirited, spiky, and oddly shaped leaves point every which way, so out of place, next to a perfect border of blossoms set in symmetrical rows. Why is it you? Almost everyone wishes were gone. The next poem I also wrote last winter, during the endless winter, and it's called Asana, which means pose in Sanskrit. It's that cabin fever time of year, needing more than a treadmill, facing a wall. I take myself to the trail to view hints of history where train whistles once blew, letting snowflakes melt in my hair and tasting them on my tongue. Others walk with iPods. I'm tuned into earth and sky. The rustling of hungry hawks in the trees. The sound of scrunching snow. My mind's in a yoga pose. I'm going to read a couple more poems, and then I'll be done. This poem is based on a newspaper photo that I saw. It's called They Will Be Watching. Children unheard, cowering, cringing, wondering what's wrong, exhausted from trial and error, dragging their broken questions, sinking in purple-tinged shadows, hiding fears in fantasy, receding into walls, becoming one with walls. The venom and shouting bounce off them. Shards of shattered plates nick them. Someday they'll emerge to replay the scene, and the walls will be watching. And this is the last poem that I'm going to read, and it's the only nature poem I'm going to read, and it's about Town Forest Pond in West Simsbury. It's called Autumn's Eve Chill. Gusting from nowhere, winter's hint ripples the surface of silence. In a split-second race, leftover light sails on a shiver of waves to suddenly sink into stillness. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. You've reminded us of all the affairs of life, its joys and sorrows, its weeds and its flowers, its young and its old, and we are much the richer for it. And also thanks to Ken Picard and Karen Handeville for making this program possible. Do visit the Antrim House website, antrimhousebooks.com, to learn more about Joan Kantor and her wonderful book, Shadow Sounds. Read some sample poems from it. And come back in another month for the next episode in Speaking of Poetry. Thank you very much.